By the time we reach the Broadway 2026 season, the conversation is no longer just about whether a given year feels creatively strong or weak, but about whether the system that produces Broadway itself is still capable of consistently sustaining the level of risk that once defined its identity. Because what is emerging is not a single aesthetic trend, but a structural reorganization of how commercial theater is developed, financed, marketed, and ultimately consumed. The phrase lean season suggests a temporary condition, as if Broadway is simply moving through a cycle of weaker output. But the evidence across recent seasons points towards something more persistent, where production patterns, audience behavior, and financial structures are converging into a new baseline that favors stability over experimentation, familiarity over invention, and predictability over volatility. In the 2026 season specifically, the headline layer still appears active and commercially visible, with productions such as Ragtime demonstrating how revivals can still achieve critical traction when historical themes resonate with contemporary discourse, while stylized reinterpretations like Cats, The Jellicle Ball show how legacy material is being reshaped through aesthetic reinvention in an attempt to recontextualize familiar intellectual property for modern audiences without losing the underlying brand recognition that makes it financially viable. At the same time, productions like Schmigadoon and The Lost Boys reflect a broader reliance on pre-existing cultural frameworks, where Broadway increasingly functions not as a generator of entirely new narratives, but as a reinterpretive space for established media properties that already carry audience awareness from film, television, or streaming ecosystems. This is not accidental, nor is it purely a creative preference, but rather a response to structural incentives that have become increasingly dominant over the last 2 decades. Because beneath the visible layer of successful or high-profile shows, the 2026 season is equally defined by what does not last. One of the most notable patterns of recent Broadway cycles is the acceleration of closure timelines, where productions that once might have been expected to run for months or years now close within weeks if early box office performance does not meet projections. This includes not only experimental or mid-scale original works, but also heavily marketed productions that entered the season with substantial financial backing and recognizable creative teams. Shows such as K-pop, Almost Famous, and Lempicka have been widely discussed within industry circles as emblematic of this shift, where strong promotional campaigns and high production values were not enough to counteract weak audience retention, leading to shortened runs and early financial write-downs. What is significant here is not simply that some shows fail, which has always been true of Broadway, but that the speed of failure has increased and the margin for recovery has decreased, meaning that productions now have less time to build word of mouth, less flexibility to adjust creatively, and less tolerance from investors once early performance data becomes available. Even revivals, which historically functioned as stabilizing anchors in the Broadway ecosystem, are no longer immune to this volatility. The 2026 revival of Chess, despite its recognizable score, established cult reputation, and the presence of marquee casting intended to generate early attention, struggled to convert visibility into sustained commercial stability, reinforcing the reality that familiarity alone is no longer sufficient to guarantee box office endurance in a system where operating costs remain high and audience attention is increasingly fragmented across competing media platforms. This reflects a broader structural change in Broadway economics, where recognition has shifted from being a reliable predictor of success to being merely an entry condition that no longer guarantees survival beyond the opening phase. To understand why this is happening, it is necessary to step outside the theater itself and examine the broader media environment that shapes audience expectations before they ever encounter a Broadway production. Contemporary entertainment consumption is now deeply shaped by algorithmically structured platforms such as TikTok, YouTube, Netflix, and other streaming ecosystems, which do not simply distribute content, but actively organize it through predictive recommendation systems designed to maximize engagement, retention, and emotional responsiveness. Within these systems, narrative is increasingly experienced in fragmented, rapidly delivered units, where content is optimized for immediate payoff, constant novelty, and adaptive pacing that responds to user behavior in real time. This creates a fundamental mismatch with the structure of live theater, which remains linear, fixed, and temporally demanding, requiring sustained attention over extended durations without interruption, personalization, or algorithmic adjustment. The result is not that audiences reject theater, but that theater now operates against a background of altered attention conditioning, where expectations formed by digital platforms shape how live performance is perceived, evaluated, and economically justified. Overlaying this is the continued evolution of Broadway's audience base toward tourism-driven consumption, particularly in the post-pandemic recovery years leading into 2026, where a significant portion of ticket sales is generated by visitors treating Broadway as a cultural destination rather than a recurring local practice. This shift has profound implications for programming strategy, because tourist audiences tend to prioritize recognizable intellectual property, established titles, and culturally validated productions over unfamiliar or experimental works, not because they lack interest in innovation, but because their decision-making window is shorter and their risk tolerance is lower. As a result, productions based on recognizable franchises such as The Lion King, Aladdin, Wicked, and Hamilton continue to function as economic anchors of the Broadway system, providing long-term stability through brand recognition and global cultural saturation, while newer works must compete under far more volatile conditions. When these forces converge, the 2026 season begins to reveal a structural pattern rather than a purely artistic one. The pipeline that brings shows to Broadway has become increasingly selective, not necessarily at the level of artistic development, but at the level of financial survivability, where workshop periods are shortened, experimental staging is constrained, and projects that do not demonstrate early commercial viability are redirected toward off-Broadway or regional theaters. This creates a filtering effect in which fewer high-risk works reach full Broadway production, and those that do are often required to conform to more conservative financial expectations in order to justify their capitalization. Within this system, Broadway itself has effectively stratified into multiple layers that serve different economic and cultural functions. At the top level are large-scale commercial productions, often built on intellectual property or global brand recognition, which function as long-running financial anchors and tourism drivers. In the middle layer are original works and prestige-driven productions that attempt to achieve critical recognition and awards momentum, but operate under increasingly narrow financial margins and heightened closure risk. And beneath that exists the off-Broadway and regional ecosystem, which has become the primary space for experimentation and early-stage development, absorbing creative risk that no longer consistently transitions into Broadway-scale production. This stratification is not unique to theater, but reflects broader trends across media industries, where rising production costs and algorithmic distribution systems have widened the gap between high-budget commercial certainty and low-budget experimental innovation. What emerges from this structure is a redefinition of what success means within Broadway itself. Success is no longer primarily measured by artistic impact alone, nor even by long-term cultural influence, but increasingly by short-term financial viability, initial box office performance, and the ability to maintain audience momentum within a compressed opening window. This shift explains why productions can now close quickly even when they possess recognizable casts, strong source material, or substantial marketing campaigns, because the system has become optimized for early performance signals rather than long-term developmental growth. So when the 2026 Broadway season is described as lean, what is being described is not a lack of creativity or artistic ambition, but a tightening of the institutional conditions that determine which creative works are able to survive long enough to establish themselves within the commercial ecosystem. The art remains present in every layer of the system, from large-scale commercial productions to experimental off-Broadway work, but the pathways that allow that art to ascend into sustained Broadway visibility have become more selective, more expensive, and more sensitive to early financial performance than at any previous point in modern Broadway history. And within that narrowing structure, even productions with recognizable names, established material, or significant investment can fail to sustain themselves, not because they are artistically insufficient, but because the system that once supported longer developmental arcs and slower audience formation has increasingly shifted toward rapid evaluation, rapid closure, and rapid recalibration. Ultimately, the 2026 Broadway season does not represent an isolated moment of weakness, but rather a continuation of a long-term transformation in which Broadway is being reshaped by forces that extend beyond theater itself, including global intellectual property consolidation, algorithm-driven attention economies, and the financialization of cultural production. And in that context, the lean season is not an anomaly within Broadway's history, but a signal of its current operating logic, where stability is prioritized over risk, familiarity is prioritized over discovery, and survivability has become the central condition that determines which stories are allowed to remain visible on one of the world's most expensive stages.